يتدبرون القرآن
ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا، من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Surah An-Nisa, which means the women, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed in it many rulings relating to the relationship that people have in this life. And the surah starts with some of these rulings relating to the weak in the society, the orphans, and so on and so forth. So it's very important for us to learn these rulings because things changes in one's life. A person might be from one state to the other. A person might find himself a guardian over an orphan. What are the rulings to deal with the wealth of the orphan? This is what the verse talks about, and it makes the believers witness the perfection of the rulings of the Deen of Islam. And also for those who might lose their minds, for example, they are insane or so on. What are the rulings with their wealth? All of that is explained in the surah, and matters of inheritance when people pass away. So the religion of Islam deals with the reality of this life, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created us and created this life in such a way, and created these situations that people face from one generation to the other. And since this final revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to all mankind, it has all what it means and what it takes for them to live a goodly life according to their purpose of their life, and that is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and to have the best rules and regulations that governs their relationship to be in the most perfect way, not to be left to the human beings. And once these rulings are left to the human beings, you would find all kinds and forms of injustices and corruption and so on and so forth, and one of which is the abuse to those who are weak and oppressed. So we reached verse number 5, so we try to discuss inshallah ta'ala from verse ayah number 5 to ayah number 8 from Surah An-Nisa, and some of the rulings that we get to learn from these verses. Ayah number 5, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ولا تؤتوا السفهاء أموالكم التي جعل الله لكم قياما وارزقوهم فيها واكسوهم وقولوا لهم قولا معروفا. Which means, and do not give the weak-minded your property, which Allah has made a means of sustenance for you, but provide for them with it and clothe them and speak to them words of appropriate kindness. This is another ruling with regards to the wealth. We talked about the wealth of the orphans, and to give the wealth of the orphans whenever they reach the age of puberty, when orphanage is not their status anymore, and how to take care of their wealth when they are young, and more rulings to come with regards to the orphan in the next verse. But in this verse, verse number 5, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbidding the believers from giving somebody's wealth, not to give them the full access to their wealth. Who are these people? As-sufaha. وَلَا تُؤْتُوا سُفَهَاء. Tu'tu, to give. As-sufaha are the ones that are weak-minded. They are part of those who are weak in the society, and their weakness when it comes to their intellect. They don't have the ability to make decisions for themselves because of their insanity, whether it's full or half or whatever. So they don't have the capacity to use their wealth in the proper way, in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the wealth for. So what to deal with these people? And again, as-sufaha, it's not something that is left for people's judgment. It's something that is so clear. People sometimes they're born by this, or they lose their minds, and they don't have the capacity to deal with many things in their life. They might take the money and burn it, for example, or waste it in haram. So they become not fit, basically, to deal with their own money. So the freedom and the ownership of wealth is not something that is unconditioned, and it's not ultimate, it is conditioned. So if a person's wealth and he has the freedom to do whatever he wants to do with it, as long as it's not something that is harmful to others, and as long as it's not used in a wasteful way because of some loss of one's intellectual abilities to deal with his own wealth in the proper way. So sometimes it happens as a result of reaching olden age. A person becomes very old that he doesn't have the capability of dealing with his wealth in the proper way, so people can deceive him. He might throw it away or tear it apart or whatever there is, so people have to take measures to protect that wealth, because it shows the importance of wealth in the religion of Islam, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created wealth for a reason, to spread what is good and to prevent what is evil. Or someone that is born with this capacity or with a disease that prevent the person from dealing with things in a proper way. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَا تُؤْتُوا سُفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمْ. Do not give the sufaha, those who are weak-minded, those who have some retardation or some no capacity to deal with money. Do not give them your wealth. Do not give them your wealth. التي جعل الله لكم قياما. Your wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it for you qiyaman. Qiyaman literally means standing, but it's means of sustenance for you. Means of that you're able to fulfill certain needs in your life with your wealth. And as they say, the wealth is the main thing in this life when it comes to dealing with others. This is how people eat and sustain their life, and all by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's all owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is how people live. They have dwellings, their homes, transportations, they have cars, they take transportations, they have clothing by the wealth that they have, and so on and so forth. They do acts of worship, they build masajid, they go for hajj and umrah, they give charity, they take care of the rights of others, they get married, and so on and so forth. So people are in need of wealth. This is part of our life, and that's why it's part of the deen to earn the right way and to also spend the wealth in the proper way. This is part of the deen, and this is something that people will be asked about in the Day of Judgment. As the Prophet ﷺ said, لَن تَزُولَ قَدَمَ عَبْدٍ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, that a slave of Allah would not depart from his position in the Day of Judgment till he is asked about four things, one of which the wealth. The question of the wealth is two questions. From how did he earn it and how did he spend it? So earning is part of the deen, spending is part of the deen. There's regulations, there are rulings that we have to observe, and we have to submit ourselves to the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's definitely for our own good things in this life and in the hereafter. So if someone lost his mind, has no capacity to spend his wealth, then it's not permissible for you to give them money. Why? Because they would waste it. They might use it to harm themselves. They might use it to harm others. They might use it to abuse it, just to spend it foolishly. So it becomes haram for you to give them from your own wealth. But then what do you do with them? Because they have needs. They have needs, but they don't have the capacity to know that for themselves. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first reminding the believers that this wealth that is yours, but it's been given to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to sustain your life. So you need to witness that and observe the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا. But instead, وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا, provide for them. Provide for them what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you. Spend your money on them to give them food, to bring them food, because they are insane. So you want to give them food, they want to eat, so you spend on them. وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا. The word fiha means in it, literally. Although you might think that وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا, meaning وَارْزُقُوهُمْ minha, or you give them sustenance, means of sustenance from it, from your wealth, from their wealth. But here it gives an extra meaning that if they have money, these ones that are fools or they don't have a sound mind, don't leave their money till it's finished and waste it by giving from their money till they finish it and then they become dependent on others. It means you can use their money, you can invest their money, so that whenever they are taken from their money to be clothed and to be fed and so on, it does not decrease. So this is out of the benefit to them. And also for one's wealth, that means don't keep the wealth like this for the sake of wealth, but instead try to invest it and so on. Of course, each one would know best how to do with one's wealth in the proper way so that a person does not lose his wealth. وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا, so give them, feed them with means of sustenance. وَكْسُوهُمْ, وَكْسُوهُمْ means and give them means of clothing. Clothe them. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, and it's mentioned in Surah Al-A'raf that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had brought down libasan, which means of clothing for us, and to cover our private parts and to cover our bodies from the heat, from the cold. So we as human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored us with means of clothing and so on. This can be a fitna for the person, it can be a trial for someone, because with that same fact of clothing, people can commit sins by wearing things that is not permissible for them to wear. That's why it's also deen, it's also religion, that we have to learn and we have to be patient to apply the orders of Allah. As you see, Islam is such a comprehensive way of life. So for example, for men versus women, different dress codes that we're ordered to observe, and the awrah, the private parts, to be covered, and the hijab for women and so on, and to avoid the clothing that is specific for the disbelievers, so that the Muslim has uniqueness in the way they look and the way they dress and so on. Not to expose one's beauty or to cause fitna or to cause sins to be spread on the face of earth, the tight clothing and so on and so forth. And not to be extravagant, that makes the person arrogant and so on. People should be humble. Wearing nice clothes, there's nothing wrong with that, but to be permissible and not to be arrogant and to be humble and so on and so forth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering those who are in charge of those who are insane and so on, is to provide for them, to clothe them, وَكْسُوهُمْ, by your wealth, وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا, and speak to them a good speech, kind and appropriate speech. Do not abuse them, do not talk harsh towards them. Why? Because there are people that lost their minds. So they need to be dealt with kindness, because they would come and say things that are so foolish, or things that might make you upset and angry, or they would do things that might make you upset and angry, but don't forget that they are not responsible for their actions. So that means you need to deal with them with kindness. And that's the case with anyone that is not responsible for their actions. You teach them if there is means of teaching, like a child, for example. The child is not responsible for his own actions. But what do? We leave them to do whatever they want? Of course not. We teach them. We enforce what is good for them to get used to what is good, and to make them stay away from what is evil, so that they get used to stay away from what is evil. But if they do a mistake or so, we gently correct them and teach them and so on. And the same thing with those who lost their minds, whether they're a child or not. Not to speak in a harsh way to them, because they're not responsible for their actions, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. So as the ulama, they say, for example, they ask for clothing or they ask for food, do not give them hard times, and do not speak to them in a harsh way. What happened to the clothes that I just bought for you? What happened to this? And so on. But instead, to be kind to them, even if you cannot afford whatever, but just to be kind. وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. So see, to that extent, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering the believers to be kind to those who are weak in the society, even though they lost their minds, to be kind to them and to speak kindly to them, and not to hurt their feelings, or not to say that they are insane anyway, so I can just treat them the way I want. No, this is orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be observed. So this is with verse number 5, with regards to the wealth to the given to the people, those who lost their minds or lost the capacity to deal with their wealth. And some of the rulings of fiqh can pertain to this. If someone lost his wealth or lost his mind, again, a father, for example, lost his ability to spend his money in the proper way, and he has a lot of wealth, This can be means for the children, for example, to abuse the father and to take his wealth without the right to do so. So that means that needs for the rulings of a judge or the system to interfere, in which things will be dealt with in the proper way, and a guardian then should be in charge of his wealth for the benefit of his wealth. More rulings, of course, but this is again in general to show the importance of realizing this and living our life accordingly. We continue, inshallah ta'ala, with more in this set of verses in the Surah An-Nisa after the break, so stay with us, inshallah.
يتدبرون القرآن
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah. Continuing with the set of verses in Surah An-Nisa from verse number 5 to verse number 8, and with verse number 6 more rulings with regards to the orphans. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى حتى إذا بلغوا النكاح فإن آنستم منهم رشدا فادفعوا إليهم أموالهم ولا تأكلوها إسرافا وبدارا أن يكبروا ومن كان غنيا فليستعفف ومن كان فقيرا فليأكل بالمعروف فإذا دفعتم إليهم أموالهم فأشهدوا عليهم وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ حَسِيبًا, which means, and test the orphans until they reach marriageable age. Then if you perceive in them sound judgment, release their property to them, and do not consume it excessively and quickly, anticipating that they will grow up. And whoever, when acting as a guardian, is self-sufficient should refrain from taking a fee or so, and whoever is poor, let him take according to what is acceptable. Then when you release their property to them, bring witnesses upon them, and sufficient is Allah as accountant. Here the verse talks about some of the rulings with dealing with the wealth of the orphans. And of course the subject of this are the guardians of the orphans. And the orphans are again weak in the society. If they are not dealt with in the proper way, people can abuse their rights. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protecting the rights of the orphans by setting these rules and regulations. وَبِتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى. وَبِتَلُوا means test, and that comes from al-bala, test. Comes from the trials and tribulations, the difficulties that people face on the face of earth. It's by the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a test for them, whether they are still patient with the orders of Allah, applying the orders of Allah or not. So wabtalu mean and test. That means you test who? The orphans. وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى, the orphans. حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحِ, till they reach, when they reach the age of a nikah, the marriageable age, which is the age of puberty, which people are responsible for their actions. So you have their wealth, you have the authority to deal with their wealth in the proper way, and they don't have access, full access to their wealth because you are in charge of it, because they don't have the capacity to use it in the proper way. So when they reach the age where they are to given their wealth, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا, you have to test them to see whether they have a sound judgment, whether they are insane or not. How would they deal with their wealth? And this, as the ulama, they say, it's not like after they reach the age of puberty, it's when they're close to that age. So when they're close to that age, you try to test them. How do you test them? You give them some money and you ask them to do something, or you see how they deal with money. And each according to their culture and their way they live and so on, but to give them some responsibility with wealth. Whether it's that you give them to do something for you or to give them ownership of the wealth. And this is the real test, that they own a certain portion of wealth, and to see how they deal with the wealth. Do they lose it? Do they act foolishly? And if there is means of teaching them, you teach them, and you see that there is some progress, mashallah, this is great. But if they are not responsible, then you wait till they become responsible. فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا, which means if you perceive in them sound judgment. فَدِفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُمْ, give them their wealth. فَدِفَعُوا give away or give them the wealth that you were responsible for. This part of the verse also shows that those who reach the age of puberty is not necessarily that they are fit or they can get married at that age, because it needs also the capacity that a person would have, the mental capacity. Physically, a person might be able to do so, but the mental capacity, the responsibility, realizing the responsibility that he will be in authority, responsible of a household, that's very important. And that's why the rushda, which means the sound judgment, for a person to have the ability to make decisions. This is when the person then can get married and so on. فَدِفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُمْ, then give them their wealth. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوهَا إِسْرَافًا وَبِدَارًا أَن يَكْبَرُوا. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوهَا, again the verb here that is used is to eat. Do not eat their wealth, and the meaning of that is do not consume it, do not take it for yourself in an unjust way. For two reasons people would do that: إِسْرَافًا وَبِدَارًا أَن يَكْبَرُوا. إِسْرَافًا, wastefully, that you would use their wealth or consume it excessively. And al-israf is forbidden, to excessively spend one's wealth or let alone someone else's wealth. Since the guardian is responsible for the wealth of the orphan, so they would spend from that wealth on the orphan. So they can either spend excessively or they can spend in the proper way. It is not permissible for them to spend it excessively. And al-israf or excessively means that they spend it in something halal, something permissible, but in extreme way. The tabdhir, or which is another word, means that if you spend something in haram, this is if it's even 1 penny or $1 or whatever small amount of money, you know, the slightest amount of money, it's not permissible to spend it in haram whatsoever. But the excessiveness, if it's spent in halal but in an excessive way. So this is not permissible, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning them that you give the money to the orphans if they become responsible for their actions and they reach the age of puberty, and warning the guardians of the orphans not to consume their wealth, whether it's excessively, when they're, before of course you give them the money, use it excessively since it's not your wealth. And this is also shows that human nature, they tend to do this unless they have the fear of Allah or something else, which is, if it's not their wealth, they would consume it excessively, even if they would do it or spend it in the right way, but they don't really care too much as they would care for their own wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warning the guardians of the orphans not to do such an evil act. And this is something that people see a lot when they give their wealth for someone else to invest it for them, right? Unless there is clear regulations and rulings, some people, they would abuse the money of others. They don't deal with it in a haram way. This is how they think. They're not lying, they're not abusing it, they're not stealing it, but they would risk it more than they would risk their own wealth. So if they lose the wealth, it's not their wealth, and this is not permissible for the Muslim to be not caring about someone else's wealth. But instead, a Muslim should have the nasiha, or the sincere concern towards others, whether they are guardian over their wealth, like the orphans, or in any form of a relationship, partners in a business, and so on and so forth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning the guardians not to consume the wealth of the orphans, israfan, excessively, وَبِدَارًا أَن يَكْبَرُوا. Bidaran from al-mubadara means that they're getting older and they're approaching the age of puberty and they have a lot of wealth. So the guardian of the orphans start to spend of their money a lot. Why? Because in haste, before they reach the age where they take the money. So this is definitely also a form of cheating. This is not being sincere. He's not spending from their wealth for the benefit of the orphans, but rather he is doing this, even he might justify it for himself, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the hearts. He's doing that so that he can get rid of it before they reach the age of puberty, so that he would get a share of this. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوهَا, and do not consume it, إِسْرَافًا, excessively, وَبِدَارًا أَن يَكْبَرُوا. And it shows that the guardian of the orphans, he has some access to benefit from the money of the orphan in a decent way, in a sincere way. Whether it's to take a fee or to for the money to be used, since he's taking care of the orphan, eating something simple like that, but not to consume the money, as we heard that this is haram. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ كَانَ غَنِيًّا فَلْيَسْتَعْفِفْ. Whoever, مَنْ كَانَ غَنِيًّا, whoever was rich and has means of wealth, he is self-sufficient, and that's what ghani means. Ghani not necessarily means someone that is rich according to the standards of people. This can mean someone that has so much wealth. But ghani means that he is not dependent on others, meaning that he does not take money from others in a humiliating way, whether it's begging or aid or whatever. Someone that is self-sufficient, he is sustaining his own life by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by his own effort, he inherited money, whatever there is. So whoever was self-sufficient and he's a guardian over an orphan, فَلْيَسْتَعْفِفْ, he should refrain from taking a fee to take care of the wealth of the orphan, to take anything from the money of the orphan if he's spending on the orphan, or even to leave it totally for the orphan when he grew up, and to invest it even for him. So if someone that is a guardian over an orphan, the highest level, the best way whatsoever is to keep the wealth and to invest it and to increase it for that orphan without taking anything from it, even if it's a necessity for the orphan, because he has the right to clothe the orphan, for example, from his wealth, to feed him from his wealth, right? But a higher level, if a person is self-sufficient and he can do that, he would not take any of this, and he would keep it and increase it even for the orphan till he grow old, and then he would be given the full money, and this is by the mercy of that person. What is permissible if a person is not self-sufficient and he can take from the money of the orphan what spends on the orphan without excessiveness, without spending it in a haram way, and there is no harm if he, for example, he buys a meal for him and he eats with him. There's nothing wrong with that, but without excessiveness. It's because if it's his own wealth, how would he spend? This is the same way with decency and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encouraging the guardians of the orphans to have iffah, to have or to refrain in a good way from the wealth of the orphans, so that they don't fall into what is doubtful, and to refrain if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had bestowed His favor upon the guardian which he's having wealth and so on. وَمَنْ كَانَ فَقِيرًا فَلْيَأْكُلْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, which means that if a person is poor, let him take according to what is acceptable. If he's poor and he's taking care of the orphan, there's no harm if he takes from the wealth of the orphan what is ma'rufan. Ma'rufan means what is known to the people to be acceptable, the norm of the society, something that he would not be ashamed to say it to everyone, to make it publicly. Something that is known to the people, then that person or the guardian of the orphan can take that portion. Why? Because he's taking care of the orphan. But this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is well aware of what people do. And if a person would deceive others and take more and hide and so on, then definitely this is an evil act, and it's, as we heard before, this is a major sin. But what is known among the people, and that's why the sin sometimes, and this is a good example of it, is as the Prophet ﷺ said, الْإِثْمُ مَحَاكَ فِي الصَّدْرِ أو فِي صَدْرِكَ وَكَرِهْتَ أَنْ يَطَّلِعَ عَلَيْهِ النَّاسِ, which means sin is what حَكَ فِي صَدْرِكَ, that you feel something inside, it's itching inside, not physically, but you feel something within yourself, in your heart you feel that it's not right, and you would not like for people to know it. So this is a way to get to know these things that might not be very clear to us. Like this is one example of it. Taken a person, a guardian, an orphan, and it's taken from his money. Would you like for people to know about this? If they know about it, it's with not just that you're taking something from it in the rightfully way, not in a haram way, but also the amount that you're taking and the way that you're using the money for. So if you don't like for people to know that, that means there's something wrong. That means stay away from it. And of course the best is to stay away totally from taking anything from the orphan if a person is self-sufficient, which is the guardian. But it's very important that we understand and differentiate between this case and the case that was mentioned earlier. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade the guardian of the orphan to take from his wealth without the right to do so, whether it's to add it to his own wealth or to exchange it with something that is less quality from his wealth. This is definitely haram. So it's haram for the guardian to take from the wealth of the orphan to add to his wealth. But if the orphan the person is spending on him from his wealth, spending on the orphan, and there might some small things that happens that he would have a share in this while he's spending on the orphan, right? Then that this is something permissible, and it's what's best is to stay away from that totally and to refrain oneself from that. فإذا دفعتم إليهم أموالهم فأشهدوا عليهم. Another ruling, if you give them their wealth, when you release their property to them, when you give it to them because they reach the age of puberty and you have seen in their dealings that they have sound judgment, because these are the two conditions, not just reach the age of puberty and they can use it in haram and drugs and so on. No, instead they have the sound judgment. Then when they reach that age and you give them the money, فَأَشْهِدُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. Have witnesses, bring witnesses upon them that you have given them their money. And this is very important. Why? Because sometimes people forget, or people become evil and they lie and they want to claim the rights of others or the wealth of others. So to eliminate the ways of shaitan that can come into between people and their relationships and sever it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering the believers to have witnesses, so that if something happens or someone claimed that he didn't take his money, then the witnesses are there and they would witness for or against. So this is an order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it should not be belittled. It should be taken care of the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered. فَأَشْهِدُوا عَلَيْهِمْ. Take witnesses for such an act. وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ حَسِيبًا, which means sufficient is Allah as accountant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sufficient, and He knows exactly what everybody does. So be watchful of this. Make sure that you're doing this while you are knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching us. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that ordered us to do these rulings, and He is subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that would count everything that you did. So with the slightest amount of wealth, Allah knows best whether it's taken rightfully or is taken unjustly, on how much and how big or small, and everything the person will be questioned about in the Day of Judgment. And the slightest amount of wealth that is taken without the right to do that, this can be the reason for the person to stay in hellfire for a long time. So unless a person would repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then after that, with more ruling, in the next verse number 7, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا, which means for men is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, and for women is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, be it little or much, an obligatory share. للرجال نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون. We'll discuss inshallah ta'ala this verse and the translation of it and the meaning of it after the break, so stay with us inshallah ta'ala. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Verse number 7, Surah An-Nisa, and rulings pertains to inheritance, and that starts the introduction to some of these rulings that are mentioned in the Quran with the perfection of the rules from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect the rights of people in their life and after they pass away, and to see how wealth is such an important thing in the religion of Islam, and we will be asked about it in the Day of Judgment. And we are not just allowed to do whatever we want with it. We are responsible for our wealth during our life, and even some people, they go to the hellfire as a result of being unjust in their will, when they write a will that is unjustly. So ayah number 7, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا, which means for men is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, And for women is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, be it little or much, an obligatory share. للرجال نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون. For men, there's a share, right? Share of what? مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون, what the parents and the relatives they leave. Leave meaning that they passed away and they left wealth. So there are men and women, the inheritance. Basically, it's talking about the heirs, those who would inherit their wealth from parents or from relatives. So the men, they have a share. And وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيب. And for women, they have also their share. مِمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ وَالْأَقْرَبُونَ. And it's repeated again so that the matter is clear that also women, they have a share from what the parents and the relatives they left behind. مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرٍ. Be it little or much, the wealth that is left behind after a person dies, or the distribution of the shares, because the shares sometimes different from one person to the other, depends on the relationship that that person has with the deceased. So these are rulings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that wealth that is left behind has to be disposed in the proper way and given to those who deserves it. You would find in some places where when somebody dies and they leave wealth, it all goes to the wife, or it all goes to the son or the boys, the offspring that are male, and nothing for the females. Or in some cases where the government of some countries will take the whole wealth of a person and deprive the wife and the children from anything. And this is all forms of injustices. This is abusing the rights of others. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is explaining the matter clearly in the Quran, that when a person dies and he or she they had wealth, then this wealth is to be distributed in a very specific and detailed way. It's very specific with the precision that goes all the way to the slightest amount of currency, percentage and everything like that. So whether it's men or women, مِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ, whether it's little or big, it doesn't matter. It has to be distributed according to the shares that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, نَصِيبًا مَفْرُوضًا, an obligatory share. And that's why when we talk about matters of inheritance, when a person dies, the first thing to be observed from one's wealth is to get that deceased buried from his wealth. So there is money for the preparation of the burial, the funeral, and so on and so forth. So it has to be taken from his money, and they would take care of that. That's even before the debt that he has or the rights of others, because this is the right that this person is to be buried, not to be left like that without being buried. Then after that, what comes in order is the rights of others that maybe he did not fulfill during his life. Loans that he has that people would claim, that should be given from his wealth that he left behind before it's distributed to the heirs. It should be given if people have rights on him, whether it's loans or whatever. Means of expiations, expiation of an oath. The person didn't make Hajj, for example, then a portion of the wealth should be taken out for someone to make Hajj on his behalf. This is the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that should be observed. And then after that is to look into the will. If he left a will, to look into the will, and the will only deals with up to 1/3 of what is left behind, not the whole wealth. So if a person writes in his will that all of my wealth goes to whatever hospital or what person or that person or the other, it is not to be fulfilled. The will should not be fulfilled, even if there are witnesses and so on and so forth. Why? Because the will is only up to 1/3 of what he leaves behind. This is the deen of Islam, and this is what the Prophet ﷺ stated clearly, that the person cannot write for in his will more than 1/3 of his wealth, and 1/3 is too much. As the Prophet ﷺ said, he should write 1/5, for example, as Ibn Abbas, for means of charity, for whatever there is. But the rest of the wealth to be distributed according to the shares that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and to leave one's heirs as rich if a person has the means of wealth, so that they do not depend on others. And also, which is again, there are many rulings when it comes to the wasiyah or to the will, but one of which, la wasiyyata liwarith, that means someone that inherits money already by the rulings of the Deen of Islam and he has a fixed share or so, he is not to be given anything or written anything for him in the will, because he will inherit anyway with a fixed share. So after that, then after the will is for the money to be distributed among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that they inherit with fixed shares, with ta'asib, what is left, and so on and so forth, with the ruling of inheritance. So the men and the women both, they have share according to the details that will come later. And the benefit of this is a general statement. The verse is general, and then you would find in verse 11, for example, more details, very specific details. And this is, in many places of the Quran, this is the way of the Quran. And that gets the person excited to know what is the details after what is mentioned in general is mentioned. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the last verse in this episode, وَإِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةَ أُولُو الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ فَارْزُقُوهُم مِّنْهُ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. And when other relatives and orphans and the needy are present at the time of division, then provide for them something out of the estate and speak to them words of appropriate kindness. They used to, before the Prophet ﷺ, or in some places till today they do that, is when someone dies, at the time of distributing one's estate and one's wealth, after taking care of all the things that we mentioned, people would attend such a gathering, and there's witnesses and so on. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَإِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةِ, if those who will be present at the time of al-qisma, or the time of the division of the properties, أولو القربى, the relatives, al-yatama, the orphans, wal-masakin, the poor. أولو القربى, they are the relatives, although the relatives we know that they inherit. So what is meant here are the relatives that won't inherit, because not all the relatives that inherit. There are certain criteria, and some relatives they don't inherit whatsoever, and some relatives because of the presence of closer relatives to the deceased, then they are deprived from inheriting with the rulings of inheritance. So those who would not receive anything from the inheritance and the division of the estate and the wealth, and they are present, and the orphans, if there are some orphans, if there's poor people, sometimes the poor people would hear and they would go attend. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala see the kindness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordering the believers to observe. فَارْزُقُوهُم مِّنْهُ, give them something from what the deceased left behind. Provide for them. You know, provide for who? Give something for those relatives, those who would not inherit with the specific shares. Give to the orphans that are present. Give to the poor that have nothing to do with it, but they were present. Give them something. It doesn't have to be a percentage or a big portion of it, but give them something out of your goodwill. Something that would make them satisfied and so on. Not a major part of the property, of course, but anything, any form of money, and you consider that as a charity. وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا, and speak to them a kind and a nice word. And again, it's repeated again after we heard it about the sufaha, about those who lost their minds. Also, for the poor that come these types of gathering, do not tell them why you're here for, leave, you know, and people become harsh against them. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us, ordering us to speak to them a kind word. Being in need is not an easy matter. And if a person is in need, sometimes that lead the person to do haram and commit sins. And part of these sins is to lie, is to humiliate oneself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering those who are rich and they are in that such an occasion which the wealth that they didn't earn, it's the wealth of someone deceased and they were just related to that person. So it's not reality in real that they earned this money, it's just this is the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So observing this, they should not forget about those who are poor, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destined for them to be poor. Be kind to them, give them something while the distribution is occurring, and also at the same time speak to them what is good. Speak to them what is good out of your goodness, out of the do not humiliate them, do not ask them to leave and so on. It's to help them and to give them. And that's also in the case of any place. Sometimes people are gathering for food, for example, in the masjid or in a public place or whatever, and you find maybe in certain places the poor will come. And some people would come and they're hoping to gain something or to receive something. Do not say harsh words to them. And this is something to be learned from this verse. Give them something. If you're gathered, family, people are just, having some form of a gathering and food and so on, and they're in a public place or whatever, and people come and they come closer and they're kind of poor, prepare something for them. Give them something. Speak nice to them. Don't say they're here, they're professional beggars, they're this or that. Just be kind as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us. And this is not just when there is some form of a gathering of distributing one's wealth. We also see that death, since it's something that is inevitable, and we all shall witness this moment, we have to always pay attention to our wealth, and that our wealth and whatever means of wealth we have, we will be asked about it in the Day of Judgment. And how to use it during our life in the proper way, because one day we have to depart from it and we leave it for others, which is a great lesson. This wealth that people kill each other for and commit sins for, one day they're going to leave it for others. And that's why when the Prophet ﷺ reminding the companions radiallahu anhum saying, أَيُّكُمْ who among you مَالُ وَرِثِي أَحَبُّ مِنْ مَالِهِ, who among you the wealth of his inheritor is more beloved to him than his own wealth. That means what? When you die and your wealth goes to your inheritor. So they said, of course we love our wealth more, because who cares when a person dies? So the Prophet ﷺ said, your wealth is what you spend now, and the wealth of your inheritor is what you leave behind. That means what? That means spend from your wealth while you're still alive, for the sake of Allah, for good cause. And at the same time, don't leave your inheritors poor, depending on others. It's a good intentions to leave something for them, of course, but not to commit haram, not to make it difficult for oneself just because of accumulating and amassing the wealth, when at one moment, at one day, people would leave it behind. Observing these rulings and being just in one's dealings, and those who are alive to observe these types of rulings, this is part of our deen, not culture, not what the people do in their tribes, in their cities, in their courts. It's according to the deen of Islam, and that's what we need to focus on and learn and teach it to others. And with more of these rulings inshallah ta'ala to come, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who understand and learn and apply that in our life. We continue inshallah ta'ala next time, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us life. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا.